Alrighty guys, welcome. Good evening to everyone. We're going to continue our conversations tonight about cooperation. We've talked a little bit about gathering money collectively as a congregation. What is that money used for? Why do we gather it in the first place? How is that different from individual giving that we're all called to do as believers? Just to give a little outline for the rest, we only have a few classes left, and so we're going to have our part 2 of our money conversations tonight. Next Wednesday then will be the history of this. So we're going to look at when did we go from local bodies gathering money together for spiritual purposes and for the Lord's family into now there's an obligation to give to different organizations and institutions, and those are going to be the people who are in charge of caring and nurturing for different individuals, different needs. And then also we're going to see the history and the development of churches giving money to things called missionary societies. Those come up big time in our history timeline. So history of cooperation will be next Wednesday, but we're going to finish our conversations on biblical patterns and biblical principles about collection and money tonight. Reading the little conclusion paragraph of one of the essays I read about this topic, this particular individual was not happy with the idea of this saints-only doctrine and was arguing on behalf of church giving to all types of people, believers or non-believers. This is how they wrap it up. They say this: the royal law, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, James 2:8, means that Christians will not only love and help fellow Christian neighbors, but they will do the same for non-Christian neighbors. This passage from James 2:1 through 11 shows if the church is willing to only help needy Christians, it is showing favoritism, James 2:1, and is guilty of, quote, discrimination from James 2:4 in refusing to help non-Christians. Then they end with this: if we're going to go along with the idea that the church can only help other Christians, this would mean that the church can teach Christians to be good Samaritans, Luke 10, but the church herself cannot practice what it teaches. This is our conversation. This is where we left off. We're going to spend the first about half or so of class literally just reviewing the different topics we looked about. We had great discussion last time, and I'm so thankful for that. I'm really looking forward to the latter part of class tonight because we're going to put real quotes that I read from these different authors that say, well, what about this? Well, what about this? What about this? And we're going to try to build a defense for this. I thought about Harry Potter, people who know the Harry Potter things. There's a class that they take, I think it's called like Defense Against the Dark Arts. And so it's them trying to learn all these skills to combat evil. And that's such a difficult conversation with this because when I'm reading these different people, they're not asking for things that are outrageously evil. They're not people who are arguing for different views of marriage. They're not people arguing for people to have abortions, things that we would just flat out say like that's evil. I can't even read that. They're arguing for, hey, we should take care of the poor in this way. We should feed the hungry in this way. But yet there's still a biblical principle that needs to be applied. And so there's going to be a lot of emotions in these quotes. There's a lot of emotion that they try to draw upon because it is a quote-unquote good cause, but we need to go back to what do we have the ability and the authority to do in the Scripture. These are some of the questions that we asked last class. I love starting out with a question just to see what's our main point here. Why do we even take up a collection? Can I answer that openly now that we had our first class? Maybe a little bit of history of Christ in the Gospels. Why even bring up a collection? Why pool together resources at all as a local body? Why do we do that?
To provide for evangelism for people's souls.
Yeah, so one of the first reasons that we see in the book of Acts is we're gathering money together, and that's going towards supporting the furthering of the word. I love that because do you see function in that? We spent 2 whole class periods talking about the function of the church. Our function is primarily spiritual. It makes sense that our money supports our function. What else? Why do we gather? Why do we take up a collection? Yeah, so we have saints here locally and also saints abroad who might have various needs. And we looked at examples for both of those last time. Taking care of the individual needs here, that is a beautiful privilege of what the church is, and that's by design. And so you'd be like, well, isn't that, a little discriminatory to have favoritism towards these people here? That's what they were trying to argue out of James chapter 2. And I would say, no, exactly. Yeah, we are to care for our local body. And then we also talked about the gathering of finances for the saints who are suffering in Jerusalem during their famine. That's also Christians helping other Christians. We're going to get into this conversation a little bit towards the end, but really this is going to be a question for next class. We've been talking about gathering money together. Why do we gather money? What's the purpose of the money? We're going to also talk about, though, the individuals who are doing this. That matters as well. When we read through all these different passages and you see that God emphasizes over and over and over again the specific handlers of the money, we need to take note of that. We can't just say, oh, there are these strict rules for what we can spend and what we can't spend. Well, there are also pretty clear standards of who is doing those different transactions. So that's going to be a question we have as well. This is where we talked about Christ himself. He gathered together a treasury. And a lot of people will argue this. They'll say, well, there's no treasury. Show me, book, chapter, verse, the church treasury. And here we talked about the idea of, well, Judas just had a money bag. And that's just what he gathered together with. And that's totally fine. We understand that if there's going to be funds that are going to be spent, it makes sense then that there has to be a collection of said funds. We talked about caring for the local body. This was Ed's point. We're going to take care of the individuals who are here. And then we're also going to take care of our worldwide spiritual family. Those are the main 2 topics that we talked about last class. I'm going to pause here, though, just open it up for comments or conversation. What do you think is the main takeaway of these? And then why do you think God made it this way? I want to talk a little bit about, why? Why is it? Is it just random that God wanted to structure financial giving like this? Or was there some sort of a message that he's trying to say about giving? So I just want to pause here for comments if anyone has them. Yes?
I think it kind of ties in with our church as a family class. If you think of a family, and that family is in need, it's the first priority of that family to care for that family. It's kind of intuitive, but if Lena is suffering, if she's sick or ill or in need, it's my job to provide for her. And for our future child, it's going to be our job to provide for that child. Why? Because we're a family. That kind of intuitively makes sense. Well, in our church family, it's the primary purpose of our church family to take care of our church family. And generosity we do outside of that church family is an inherently different issue.
I love the family conversation because we're using metaphors that God himself uses. People say, well, what's the difference between giving money to this person or this person? Well, one of them I call brother. And that title does designate a responsibility on my part and on the part of the collective. Thank you. What else can we say here about purpose? Why is it structured this way? Is it just, willy-nilly, we're going to spend in this way, but no, you can't spend this way? There's got to be some type of a purpose behind it.
My mind always goes to evangelism and how being part of God's family comes with special privileges. And when you're not part of God's family, that doesn't mean you're able to partake in it. Like there's communion there, there's caring about
I love that. If we're going to say that the church is a model for some type of stability of caring and compassion, why would our finances not be tied with that if we have these close bonds with one another? Anyone else before we push on? Yes.
I think too, if we were commanded to give freely as a church to people who are not Christians, that also could be a false motive for them to want to become part of the church as well. It can almost create a sense of, they give me things, so therefore I'll claim to be a Christian, and it could just draw people in for the wrong motives.
Mhm.
I think God was just so wise to say, we're not even gonna create that as an issue. I don't want that in my church to even be an issue.
So I thought about bringing this up last class. I read one of these papers was from the Church of England website. So from their official domain, the Church of England, they are a very philanthropic organization. They're a state-funded church. They have taxpayer dollars going into it, and so they're well known in the sort of charity work that we've been talking about. The numbers that they have post-COVID are alarming. And it doesn't really make sense in my brain that we have strong, close-knitted, tight-knitted families, but then COVID comes, and the numbers were something like in the 30% of individuals who are no longer going. And I can't help but think, is there some financial ties with that? Because there's such of, well, we're going to take care of all of this, and we're going to have all these different programs that we elicit to members and non-members, but yet when the going gets tough for a congregation, they flee, they leave. It just brings up a good point, though, and amen to that. Why are we coming? Why are we coming to this? So this is where we're going to be today. That was our little bit of review. Still talking about the purpose and the handlers, though. We're going to talk about a new topic. It still has to do with this conversation, though. How are we giving? Why are we giving? Another purpose is to support ministry. That is a theme that we see throughout the book of Acts, and we see that historically, too. The early church continued to do that. So we're going to dwell here for a little bit. We're going to talk about the supporting of preaching, the supporting of evangelists. Let's go ahead and start now in 1 Corinthians, please. 1 Corinthians 9. I'll have someone read verses 1 through 12 in just a second, but as we read, I want us to look for the word and the idea of laboring. I want us to look for laboring. Maybe not so much, preaching or evangelizing. Look for the word and for the thought surrounding the word of labor. If I could have someone read 1 through 12, please.
Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Who tends to a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ.
So looking at this kind of lengthy chunk right here, what do you guys see some language that Paul is using that talks about laboring?
A
Yeah, so he uses a lot of different metaphors. One of them, he talks about a farmer. A farmer is a worker, and a farmer is not going to plow his field unless he has hope or expectation that the crop is going to be his as well. What else do we see? Different ways that Paul talks about labor here. Tending the flock, right? We have shepherd language that's always used, and there's great reward in that. A shepherd doesn't do it for no purpose. No, like that's their occupation. There's a financial benefit from here. And so we're talking about all those different ways to labor, but we know because the very end of the section, we're talking about spiritual labor here. We're not talking about the physical factory 9 to 5. We're talking about spiritual labor. So what does this have to do now with the supporting of preachers? Well, what's some of the arguments here that Paul is saying? Yeah, they're going to be worthy of support. In the very beginning, about verse 3 or so, he talks about how the jobs of the world have an expectation to be compensated for that. In verse 8, do I say these things on human authority? Or does the law not say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. I really wanted to show a picture of this. The history teacher in me wanted to show you, George Washington has a threshing barn. And it's built in the round, so it's built in a circle, and you hook up your animals to it, basically like on a treadmill, and they walk around the barn in a circle, and as they walk around, the farmers throw the wheat on the floor, and as the animals stomp, they break off the head of grain from the shaft. While they do that, though, you don't put a muzzle on the animal. It's like the harness that forbids them from eating. And it goes back to an old law principle where as they're walking around and doing work, they should be allowed to eat what's on the ground too. It's kind of a weird metaphor for us today. I mean, we're rarely seeing this. I don't know if I'll ever see this in real life other than a video. But we're talking here about spiritual work. Can we pick up at the very end? Verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? So here we have a spiritual labor that's going on. Soul work is what we might call it. And Paul says there's no reason why we should not see any type of physical benefit from that. And that's our money class. That's our money class. Whether it be the money contribution and we're giving currency for it, or we all know kind of like the old New England preachers that went from town to town to town and they were paid basically with dry goods. Same deal. Same deal. It's going to be a physical payment for spiritual work. Any comments here or questions here before we move on? Okay, let's go ahead and do our second passage here. Let's go to Philippians 4. This is another passage with some pretty rich metaphors. Then if I could have someone read 14 through 19, and as we read, be looking for this language again about labor. And see, this time as we read through, can we identify the spiritual work that is happening? The spiritual work.
It is kind of you to share my trouble. You Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving, except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the
So we've been talking about the difference of providing for the local body here, the local saints, but this is a great example to say this money was sent. This money was not hand-delivered over to someone in the local body. This money traveled. This money had some mileage on it. And what I want to pause and take some time to look at is to say that it is a fragrant offering, a sacrifice, acceptable and pleasing to God. I know that we often think about giving to the person who is poor and destitute among us. That's sacrificial giving, because we see that there's a need. But we're talking about something different here. This is in payment for someone's labor, and that as well can be a sacrifice. That as well can be an offering. Any comments here on this passage?
This is something that Morgan said, it's this partnership or communion that's happening between the church there and Paul. He mentions that. And it's something that obviously they understand. You can even extend it, in my opinion, to a contractual partnership in which the relationship itself is benefited in all sides of the giving, the receiving, and then other people receiving the gift. Because who knows? The preaching of them and the conversion of them could even extend beyond as the people grow in their faith and spread across the entire nation.
One of the cool benefits that we have with just our brotherly relationships is trust. It's not, well, we're going to send the money to you, but then we're also going to send some guy, and he's going to just check in on you, and he's going to be making sure that you have enough Bible studies going on, that you're preaching enough. No, the money is given in good faith. These are our brothers who are doing labor. All the different metaphors that we say, planting a vineyard, they're shepherding, they're threshing out the grain. They're doing the work for us, and we give money in trust. And whenever we put our faith into that, and we give to individuals who are producing good fruit spiritually, that's a sacrifice to the Lord. So we don't do this as just like, it's an obligation. We're going to give to the people who are preaching the word because we have to support them somehow. This is sacrificial giving. And I feel like we don't always think about giving to kingdom builders as a sacrificial way. We see it more as a necessity, but this is sacrifice language. Yes?
One of the things I think is really neat about both of these verses we can look at in 1 Corinthians and see we do that. We support a local preacher. In addition to maybe something you talk about that's justification for elders. If we don't pay our elders, but certainly you could by the same reasoning of the threshing, and not muzzling the ox. And then we go to the next one and we look at something we're also blessed to be able to do. We support other men who preach in other locations, and that's on the bulletin board. If you ever want to look.
Yeah, definitely. And that there is this relationship that we have with these individuals. And I mean, the purpose of this class is not to study those men and those individuals that we support, but maybe it's a good time just to pause and reflect about it. Just an additional outcome of this class. Yeah, we're here talking about money, but maybe it's a good little mental note for us right now to check the bulletin board and to see where these people are and to be memorizing these towns that they're working in, to be praying for those communities, because my money, your money that we give has sacrifice. There's a sacrifice involved in that. Any other comments for us? I appreciate the talk tonight, guys. Whenever we get towards these, different examples, well, what about this argument? What do I say? What about this argument? What do I say? I really encourage some participation there as well. I'm going to go ahead and skip past the 1 Timothy verse. It has a lot of the same language that we're talking about here. We're giving to these individuals who are preaching the word, but the preaching the word is labor. It is labor that deserves a financial backing, and that's one of our responsibilities here as a body. Any other comments, questions before I push on? Alrighty. Ryan, was that sufficient? Okay, so we went through this really quickly last class, talking about the why. I don't want us to just look at these statements and to say, this is the money belief I have to have, this is the commandment of the Lord. We should look at these things and say, God was so wise when he instructed us to do it in this way. The church is a mode in which God takes care of his people. That's what Israel was. Why did God have to make a nation? Right? Well, the nation means a lot of different things for us. There's a lot of different shadows packed into there. But the nation took care of itself, or at least it was supposed to. The church is structured on the family model. That was Nick's point. If I'm going to call you brother and sister, we say the phrase, and I loved it when we talked about the church as a family, you got a seat at the table. Well, you're going to have a seat at the table but an empty plate? That doesn't work. That's not how we treat our family members at the dining room table. Financial security of the church is a motivation, and we have to be careful with this, right? It's not to lure people into the church because of our financial stability that we have, but no, it's rather to say we follow certain principles here to where when you become a member of our family, God takes care of our needs. God takes care of our wants. We prioritize the spreading of the gospel, right? This is where we go all the way back to our function talk. Yes, we gather money together. Yes, there are expenses that we have to produce. But the spiritual growth of the Lord's church needs some money to it. It does. We can go around and we can walk and we can preach, and I'm not here to say that in order to be an effective evangelist, we need money backing us. It's not what I'm trying to say. But there are expenses associated because the person who's doing that is laboring, and the labor is worth his wages. Church is a model of stability to the world, and then that goes with our last one. As Christians, we encourage good habits that solve many of the financial and physical needs of others. I think of Augustus Pugin, that guy who we talked about with function. He was a man living in the Industrial Revolution, England time period, and he was all for, let's create these workhouses for the poor. Let's create all this public housing. Let's create all these different kitchens that take care of the industrial workers. In doing that, we are inherently supplying needs that unincentivize people to do biblical money practices. We were talking about this at dinner. If you want to learn about biblical money practices, we don't have to just stay in the New Testament and learn about the church. We can go to Proverbs, and we can read about how do we take care of our money, how do we spend our money. As a church, we should be modeling that, and part of that is taking care of our own family here. Any questions on the why? Do you have a why of your own? I know I opened up class like this. Yeah, Luke.
Maybe one nuance is the reason we spend money in this way is because we believe it's not ours. We believe it's a gift from God. So it's not my money, it's what He's entrusted to me to use for certain things.
Yeah, you talk about a worldview shift for a non-believer to come into the church and to say, well, you know, when I gave everything to Jesus, I meant that. I really meant that. And so if I have a brother who's in need, that's where the resources are going to go. I love that, yeah. Doesn't belong to us. All right, favorite part. I've been so looking forward to this literally all week. I want to talk about these different arguments. I'm going to give us time to sit down and think about it. These are all pulled. Some of them are quoted. Some of them are paraphrased to make the English a little bit easier for us. But these are the arguments that I saw most repeated over and over and over again. So when I was reading these papers, these were the arguments that people were saying, no, 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 no. The church not only can give to non-Christians, but is obligated to do so. We have just a couple of them that we're going to look at, I think 4 or 5. We'll read it. I want to have some group discussion about it, and then I have a couple points for each one that I would like to share. So statement number 1. Jesus did not question people's beliefs before doing good works. He did not check beforehand to see if they were Christian. A lot of the stories that they talked about was, you know, the feeding of the 5,000. We're going to go through and do an inventory of all 5,000 people to make sure that they have the proper beliefs about Jesus before money is given to them, food is given to them. No, Jesus would never do that. He doesn't care about the belief of the individual. He only cares about the need being met. What do we say to that? What do we say to that?
I think the feeding of the 5,000 was kind of a one-time event, not a social welfare program. I think about a more appropriate analogy would be like if we're hosting a potluck for the whole church after services, and
appreciate that. Thank you. Yes?
Didn't Jesus come to the children of Israel first?
Yeah, and there are some kind of hard passages for us, one particularly where a woman comes up and he talks about feeding the children of Israel before feeding the swine. And that he's referring to the woman who is not an Israelite. And so that's tough language. And there's no denying that the provision has always been for the Lord's people first, and then the nations. Yeah.
I kind of think of it as the 5,000 that were there, they didn't know they were going to be fed,
Mm-hmm.
beforehand. So they were wanting to hear Jesus. They were wanting to know what he had, and they were searching, and in there, their hearts were right in that.
Yeah.
They weren't there for the wrong motive and purpose.
Yeah, no, I love that. Going back to motive. And then what happens later when they come to Jesus for the wrong motive? Oh, I'm going to go back to him because he did feed me. Then he doesn't feed. And so that backs up your point as well. Yes?
We also have to remember why Jesus fed the 5,000.
Mm-hmm.
It was completely spiritual from the beginning. He was proving to them that he is the bread of life. He was sent from the Father, from heaven, to feed them spiritually. That's why he did the miracle. So the miracle was never actually about filling their stomach.
Mm-hmm.
It was never about meeting their physical need. It was about showing the people who he was.
Yeah.
And he honestly, with every single miracle, that was the point. It was never about meeting the physical need.
When we look at the mighty works and wondrous powers that Jesus performed, they were always there as proof or evidence of a spiritual claim. And so, wow, he fed all these people. That's not the great part of that story. The great part of that story is Jesus saying, I am the bread of life that fed you in the wilderness. Cool, I can feed 5,000 people. That's awesome. Not as awesome as making a claim that you are Yahweh. That's a totally different claim here. It's leading towards a spiritual purpose. Anyone else before I push on? Yeah.
Well, Jesus was also an individual,
Yeah.
not the church.
Yeah, it would be like, well, he's not giving from the church treasury. You're right. There ain't no church. There ain't no church treasury to pull from right now. So here are just some things that I have. Jesus did know the faith of those that he worked through, and he often picked them specifically because of their faith. Be like, well, Jesus healed the paralyzed man. Do you think that he went up to the paralyzed man and said, what's your system of beliefs? I got to make sure that you believe the right things. No, he says, your faith has made you well. He did know the faith of those that he was performing to. And we see that all over and over and over again. He refers back to your faith, your faith, your faith has made you well. He does know their beliefs. Church is not yet established. You might want to hit them on maybe a more practical point rather than in the spiritual depth, but we have to talk about church money in the examples we have with church money. We can't look at all the different money examples and say, well, money's being used here, money's being used here. We're talking about collected money. And so we need to go to examples of collected money. Any other comments before we see our next one? Yeah.
One of the things that I struggle with, that you want to come back to the scripture always, is that just because something's plausible or that you want to and it's a good thing, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. One of the arguments, I'm not going to say one of the arguments, that form of an argument is used over and over and over again to where people are saying, well, Jesus, and they're almost questioning whether or not God knows all things. It's almost like they're saying, well, the early apostles, they didn't know about the Industrial Revolution that was going to come. They didn't know about World War II and the great suffering and the needs that were going to come. And I'll look back and be like, they didn't see devastation from Rome. They didn't see cities swept away. They didn't know what that need was like. But again, to your idea, well, there's all these possible different situations, and the Bible doesn't speak about this situation, so maybe there's a silence issue that we're in question here. When we talk about the history next class, we're going to emphasize more silence of the scriptures because people will flat out say, well, the Bible said I can't. Okay, cool. Well, the Bible didn't say I can't. Those are very different things, and you can do a lot of very different things with those two viewpoints. We'll talk about that with our history. Here's another one. Whether it's the church giving or an individual Christian giving, it's all God's money anyways. Why does it matter where it comes from as long as the need is being met? It's coming from the church. It's coming from the individual. Why are we drawing the line? Why are we drawing distinctions here when the end goal is producing fruit? What do we say to that? It's a pretty convincing one to me, actually. That's one of the ones that whenever I was reading these through the first time, I sit there like shaking with my highlighter to be like, do I highlight that to put it in class or do I wrestle with it a little bit more? That was a wrestle. Yeah.
I think in this example, there's a trust that's being placed in the elders of the church. So they're acting in alignment with God on behalf of everyone else. So it's different than giving as an individual and knowing exactly what you intend.
Yeah. One of the conversations that we're still needing to talk about is the people who are doing the giving. There are specific rules for that. Whenever we are gathering money together and elders are in charge of that financial pool, that is gathered for a purpose different from when I take money from my own pocket. Has different purpose, has different handlers. Yeah.
I think these kind of arguments are something to be careful with, because if you asked Moses if it was that big of a deal if he speaks to the rock or strikes the rock versus what he was allowed to do once before in the past,
Yeah.
he didn't get to go into the promised land because he didn't do what God told him to do.
Mhm.
So this kind of stuff is just like human reasoning in
Yeah.
1 Corinthians 1 that talks about the wisdom of man is foolishness to God.
Mhm.
We should probably not do that.
Yeah. I love the classes that we've done before, and now we're thinking about those classes here in these conversations. We're thinking about function. We're thinking about leadership and structure of the church. We're thinking about creedal language. What do we believe? Well, we believe that the purpose of the church is that's going to drastically change the way that you deal with money. And to your point, Ryan, these are emotional on purpose. They are emotional on purpose. The language that is used here is almost poetically emotional because that is the draw. Because if we're not feeding, if we're not laboring in this certain way, look at the devastation that you caused because you did not act. The giving of the church does not excuse your individual giving. We can't push off responsibility. So we can even flip this and say, well, why do I even need to give individually at all? Whether I give individually or the church gives individually, it's still meeting the need. Be careful not to excuse yourself. Why does the church collect money in the first place? Read for me. Look for me. Find examples where we gathered money together collectively for the purpose of fill in non-saint line item. It's not there. It's not there. And we need to think about our function, about why we're gathering money in the first place. Because we're kind of flipping things up. We look at the money that's already been gathered and then we distribute. But that's not how we gathered money. We first found a reason to gather money, then pooled around it. Not looked at the pool and decided where it should go. No, we had an issue and a problem and then gathered.
I wanted to speak to this one in particular about not pushing off individual responsibility. Well, there's so many opportunities, whether it's seeking out charities that we care to do, or there might be somebody here, and this happens and it happens often, where there will be some specific giving type opportunity that the church doesn't need to give from what's been collected. You can send a text out, and to the congregation, you'll probably have thousands of dollars right then that people willingly will give to an individual on an individual basis to whatever that cause is, or some situation may be. Known in the past, whether it be a vehicle, money to go to different things, like we had this thing with adoption. There's all these babies. There's all these opportunities outside of the church, and we're still able to handle it, and it can still be done without us violating when we read scripture and go, well, God didn't want us to certainly other ways we can handle it.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean, no, we don't do anything nice for anybody whatsoever. That is not the point.
Yeah, here's a quote that speaks to that. I don't know of any congregation that isn't willing to help truly needy non-Christians. When faced with a need, brethren will individually dip into their own pockets and collect funds to help the destitute. It doesn't cross our mind to take the Lord's money to fulfill our personal responsibility. When money is contributed to the Lord, it is spent in accordance with the directions of the Lord. If we're having a problem meeting individual needs, that's not a biblical finance problem. That's a working of the church problem. That's Christians not doing Christian things problem. Push on. The Bible never mentions a church treasury. Any attempt to separate individual giving and church giving through the treasury is simply a man-made tradition. Show me where it talks about the treasury. Talk about the treasury. Oh, we can't take from the treasury. Oh, I set that money aside to put in the treasury. That's just a man-made tradition. That's nothing but a collection of yes men who approved it over the centuries.
Look, I like this one because you're looking for authority.
Yeah.
You can have a conversation about authority, but in this case, there is authority to have a church treasury. If you look in the beginning of the Acts, the formation of the church,
Mhm.
they were giving to the apostles. The apostles, they were taking care of all the needs of the brethren. They had all things in common. And to me, that speaks of a collection. But I really love the heart behind looking for authority for a treasury.
Definitely, and this is a good time to pause and talk about this too. If someone's coming up to you and talking about these financial needs, before we slash down certain arguments, can we congratulate them on their heart to want to serve and love other people the way Jesus did? That's a good talking point, and that's a good way to introduce them to the gospel and the spiritual function of the church. So yes, we should applaud individuals for seeking that out and for wanting to take care of a need. But we're focusing on the word treasury. We talked last week. It doesn't matter how you collect it. It doesn't matter if we want to put it in this location or now. The conversation then has to be, well, do we have biblical authority for it to be digital? Can we store it in a spreadsheet that is on a bank website and I don't physically have it in my hand? We get into weird arguments about that. And so let's steer away from this idea of treasury and talk about the Lord gathers money from his people. You can put it where you want. New Testament church did collect money together as a congregation. They had to put it somewhere. They had to put the money somewhere. The New Testament individuals are also commended and commanded to give privately through good works. This will be the last one. We got like a minute left. Refusing to give money for the needs of non-Christians is discrimination. James warns us about showing preferential treatments to others. This is the quote that I started off with. This is where it gets emotional. You see in these essays, about halfway through, they take a turn to where they say, no, you should, I encourage you to do so. If you don't, then you're not following the Bible. And this is where it goes. It goes to these arguments where we say, in fact, if you're not, let's call it sin, because you're missing the mark. We're commanded to do things like this. If you're not giving in this way, then it's just as bad as any other miscount to the Lord. Did you have something, Jay?
Yeah. When you first brought this up, when we looked at it, when you were looking at James 2, you made warning about this before. That wasn't talking about money at all.
Yeah.
It was talking about spiritually making sure that you are accepting everyone in, no matter what their socioeconomic status is.
Mhm.
Not what you're doing with their money. The only connection with money is where they are on the monies.
Yeah, totally. We're talking about people coming in with gold rings, and do we sit them in front? That doesn't really have anything to do with providing for needs. Adam?
I know we're out of time, but in Acts 6, there is a ministry of distributing food, and it's to Christians that are in Jerusalem. And it's really implausible to me that there's not other people who needed food, but you see the limited scope of what's going on there.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and click my last slide. I'll read it quick. But you want to talk about discrimination? The biggest act of discrimination will be on Judgment Day when Christ separates all of mankind. So there is a discrimination. And there are brother relationships and there are non-brother relationships. And we need to be gentle in those conversations, but we're not here to blur lines where Christ himself did not blur. He's not going to separate them on physical need, but he's going to separate them on a spiritual need. We'll end with this. I have no silver and gold, but what I do have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up and walk. It's got to be spiritual. We'll do this for history next class. Thank you all.